Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. This is the 1TB Steam Deck OLED, and I've had it for a couple weeks now and I've made some videos about it too. Now because it's the 1TB model, that means it has the etched glass display, and this screen does a really good job of being anti-reflective. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that the way this diffuses light also meant that it was going to be a little bit softer by comparison. And so as soon as sales opened up, I decided to buy the 512GB model, which also has an OLED screen but without the etched glass. And this is it here, and as you can see right off the bat, it is definitely less anti-reflective. So what I want to do in this video here is try to do a comparison between the two, the 512 and the 1TB models, and I've got a few tests lined up, and I think by the end it'll probably get you a little bit closer on that path to deciding between the 512 and 1TB model if you are in the market for a Steam Deck OLED. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, a couple technical notes as we first get going. Number one, when showing top-down footage like this, I wanted to emphasize the fact that my lights are at the top of the screen. And so it's not a perfect lighting setup, and the bottom will be just a little bit darker than the top. But as you can see in a screen comparison like this, it is very hard to tell whether or not that brightness is even making any sort of difference. Additionally, I did want to mention that on the OLED models, when I'm using the top-down footage, you will probably see some screen flickering. And this is not something that you'll see with the naked eye, but it more has to do with the camera settings that I have on my phone. And finally, I'm going to film this entire video in 4K and I'll be uploading it in that resolution as well. Okay, next I want to talk a little bit about the OLED versus the LCD because there have been some changes since my last review. With the most recent firmware update, we now have some color options that we can change within the settings. And if you updated your Steam Deck to the most recent version, you can find it under Settings, then Display, and then Adjust Display Colors. Now each of these two models have different sliders, but they do the same thing. On the LCD panel, you can see that it's set to the sRGB profile, but you can boost it beyond that if you would like. And of note, the color temperature between the two by default have a different setting as well. Either way, when we boost the vibrance of the LCD panel here on the bottom all the way to the max, you can see it does get a lot more vibrant. However, bear in mind that as you boost these colors beyond the sRGB space, it is going to reduce the color contrast between them. And so it'll definitely be a matter of taste which one that you prefer. Now for the OLED panel, it's already set into space beyond sRGB, but you can also push it all the way to what they're calling native. And the vibrance here goes pretty crazy. And so if you really like very rich colors, you can totally do that. But I think for my taste, it's a little bit of overkill. So I'm just going to go back to the default settings and we'll use that for all of our testing. Meanwhile, for the LCD panel, I do like the boosted color profile, but I think I am going to ratchet it back just a little bit. So I'm going to go back 2 spaces from the max. And so here's a comparison of these two screens with those color profiles. You can definitely see the color temperature is different between the two, just like it was on my original review. But I will say that the saturation on the LCD model looks a lot better now. And also bear in mind, I'm not using any additional third-party plugins to boost these colors. This is all within the Steam settings. Either way, my main point here in showing these two off is to show that yes, there's still a big color difference between the OLED and LCD panels, but the distinction between the two is not quite as night and day as it was previously. So if anything, if you have an LCD model, I would recommend updating your firmware and then trying out this new color profile and see how you like it. If anything, it might stave off the FOMO of trying to get an OLED model because the LCD one really kind of pops now. Anyway, that was all I really wanted to talk about when it came to the comparison of the OLED and LCD models. After all, this video is about comparing the two OLED models. So let's go ahead and dive into that. We're going to start here in a well-lit room, and I'll start with my 1TB OLED model at 100% brightness. And again, we're just using that default color profile for the rest of the video. Now, the biggest thing I want to show here is that the colors do look pretty good. In fact, my camera doesn't do a great job of really accurately capturing how vibrant this is, but all the same, I think you can tell that it does look very good. And of course, the big thing here is we want to check for the reflective properties of the glass. And this 1TB model is the etched glass version, which means that it is going to diffuse that light, and as a result, it won't be quite as reflective. Now you can definitely still see things reflecting in the background as I move it around, but the way I like to categorize it is that it's not quite as prominent. You might notice that there is something in the background, but you won't be able to identify it. And that's probably my favorite quality of the etched display, in the fact that when in a well-lit environment, it does reduce those reflections quite a bit. Now by contrast, here's the 512GB model that just arrived. And this one does not have an etched glass display, and as you can see, it is quite a bit more reflective. And again, the categorization here is that that we can see the reflections, but we can also identify them at the same time. Unlike with the etched glass display, you can definitely tell what's going on in the background. And so depending on how you're playing, especially in a well-lit environment like this, it can be quite distracting, especially if you can see your own face in the reflection. That's one of my least favorite properties. However, there is something to be said about how much the color pops. Again, I don't think my camera's going to pick it up quite as well as my naked eye, but I can definitely tell a qualitative difference between the two. In particular, I think the sharpness around the text really helps it to pop, and we'll talk about that more later when we do some more in-depth testing. For now, we're just really focusing on the reflective properties in a well-lit environment. Now, as a third comparison, let's check out the ROG Ally. Now, this is an LCD panel, but still one of my favorites on any handheld bar none. This one is also anti-reflective, but not etched glass. And as a result, you have a super sharp and crisp display, but also none of the reflections that you would expect like with the 512GB Steam Deck. Not only that, when looking at it straight on, it is pretty incredible. You can see that the blacks here are super dark around the edges. It's really impressive. And so I don't know what kind of magic they're using within the ROG Ally, but I really wish they had done that within the Steam Deck as well. Let's do one more comparison with the screen off to really show that reflective quality. We'll start with the 512GB, and this thing is basically a mirror. You can see me and waving and everything. Now with the 1TB model, you can still see the reflection, but it is definitely not as prominent. In fact, it has a very soft kind of halo around it, and when actually playing a game, you often will not notice those reflections, which is pretty awesome. And meanwhile, the ROG Ally in this test wins again hands down. The reflections here are even less prominent, and so again, I don't know what kind of mojo is going on here, but I want it in everything. Next, let's take a look at viewing angles, and this is where the OLED really shines. You can see here at the same angle for each of these three handhelds that both OLED models are a lot more prominent. In fact, the ROG Ally does get quite dark at different viewing angles. Now, viewing angles is not something that really makes or break a device, at least in my opinion, because often when you're playing on a handheld, you're just pointing it at your face, and so as a result, I don't think that viewing angles really matter that much, but they're also a good indicator of screen quality, and you can see here that the OLED models, yes, are definitely better at a viewing angle like this, and whether or not that's important is really going to be up to you. Okay, now let's move over to my desktop lighting, and we're going to compare the two different OLED models on a variety of landing pages. First thing of note, we are at 60% brightness just to give it a good balance with my camera settings, and like I mentioned before, you're probably going to see some flickering, but again, that is not visible to the naked eye. Either way, when comparing these two, I cannot tell a difference at all. When looking at these straight on in a controlled environment like this, the darks are just as dark and the brights are just as bright, and so I'm not really seeing this as being a good comparative example. If anything, it does give me a good indicator that when in a just typical lighting environment like this, both of these screens look great. Now, just to make sure that my studio lights are not affecting the overall picture, let's turn them off and also take a look. And again, we're at 60% brightness, so I haven't changed any camera settings at all. And honestly, between the two, again, I'm not seeing any difference. So I'm not going to split hairs about this between the two. There might be a tiny edge between the two where the 512GB model is a little bit darker in the dark spots, but I have to say that the difference between the two is just so minute that I don't think it's noteworthy. And so, okay, looking at the screens just dead on doesn't really help. So let's go ahead and bring in the help of some big guns. So I'm going to grab my macro lens and set this up with my 4K camera, and this will be a 10x zoom. And here I'm going to compare both the OLED and the LCD models just so we can get a fair balance between all of them. We'll start with a text comparison looking at the word settings here within the menu. Now right off the bat, you can see that the color profile is a little bit off. That makes sense. Again, the LCD versus the OLEDs. But the interesting thing that I found here is that in the two top models, which are both etched glass, you can probably see that the pixels around the lettering is actually a little bit softer. And to me, it's very pleasing to the eye when we're zoomed in like this. And if we look at the 512GB model without that etched glass, you can see it's a little bit sharper looking. Now, I don't think this is a bad thing. It really just shows the difference between the two, however slight. And this is what I meant when I said that the text was a little bit sharper or more prominent around the edges when looking at it at a normal zoom. It's really hard to capture just on a regular old camera, but I think the 10x zoom here of the macro lens really does kind of show that. Now, I did a bunch of different macro pictures, so let's move on from there. And here's a picture from Horizon Chase Turbo. Up top, we have both etched glass displays, LCD and OLED, and then down below we have the OLED with the regular panel. Now right off the bat, I did a very similar image last year when trying to compare the etched and non-glass versions of the LCD one, and again I'm seeing the same distinction between the two, and that is that there's a little bit of a sharpness around the details in the OLED model down below compared to the other two up top. The other two have a more soft kind of image, and depending on your preferences, you might enjoy that softer edge. In fact, for me, I actually preferred it with the the LCD models last year. Now, I got a lot of comments on that video saying that they could not tell the difference, and maybe some of that has to do with the compression that's made by YouTube. But again, I'll be uploading this in 4K, so hopefully it's a little bit more clear. And just to help out even more, I'm going to zoom in between the OLED models, and so hopefully you can see the difference. In particular, I can see a little bit of a sharper curve when it comes to the spoiler on the car, and also the beams coming from the taillights seem to be just a little bit more straight and narrow. And I hope this is coming through in the video. And again, this is a very slight difference. We are in full-on nitpick territory. Now here's another interesting one. We're going to compare the cover screen of Cult of the Lamb. And the interesting thing here is that on the 512GB model here on the bottom, when looking at it with the naked eye, those words "don't starve together" really pop compared to the LCD and OLED model up above. However, at a 10x zoom, I don't think you can really see the difference here at all. And so this is one of those things where I'm not really sure that zooming in with a macro lens is really going to show us the distinction between the two. And if we zoom in further, we can see that pixel-wise, it is almost identical between the two when looking at the words "don't starve together." So I guess what I'm saying here is the macro lens was helpful in some certain distinctions, but in others, I didn't really find it very useful. For example, in our comparison here with the Dave the Diver title screen, I don't really see a difference between them either. However, when looking at the SteamWorld Dig 2 image, I do see that the image is a little bit sharper around the edges with the 512GB OLED model compared to the two up above, and again, this is very slight. The really crazy thing about this is I thought that the macro lens was really going to show a distinction here, but it turns out that when looking at it with the naked eye is when I could really see the distinction between the two. And it didn't really happen when in a well-lit environment. I think a lot of that has to do with the reflections that are really distracting, but in a more controlled environment like here where I've turned down the studio lights and this is just kind of in a typical evening scenario, the 512GB OLED model without the etched display does pop quite a bit more than the other one. And it really becomes prominent when looking at the text. Anything that needs to be really sharp and clear just looks that much more sharp and clear when you're using this model. Now, don't get me wrong, the etched glass version still looks very good, especially in a lower light environment like this. And I've heard a lot of people saying that the etched glass one looks exactly like the glossy one when in a low light environment. And to that I would disagree, because I can see a big difference between the two, and in terms of preferences, I do enjoy the 512GB model a lot more. So I guess in a nutshell, what I'm saying here is that when you're in a brightly lit environment, you can't really tell the difference between the two as much, but in a more indoor or an evening environment, this is where it really pops. And I think a lot of people play their Steam Deck in this kind of situation. And so in that regard, yes, I think there is a big distinction between the two in favor of the 512GB model. And the other great thing is that when playing in an environment like this, the reflections just really aren't there, and so it doesn't bother me as much at all. Now, in my previous videos, I had mentioned how the 1TB OLED model looked a lot like the Switch OLED. In fact, in terms of screens that were comparative, that was probably the best closest one. And I will say that the 512GB OLED model is even closer in that regard. So I guess when it comes down to it, if you are trying to think between buying between the two and you have access to a Switch OLED panel, I would say just pick that one up and then imagine that it's on a Steam Deck, because that's almost exactly like how it is on the 512GB model. And if you really love that screen like I do on the Switch OLED, it's going to be equally good here on the Steam Deck. And at the end of the day, I think that's all I really have when it comes to these comparisons. And bear in mind, this is a very subjective video. There are many people who prefer an etched glass display because of those anti-reflective properties, but there's also a lot of people who prefer to have a more glossy display, especially on an OLED panel, because that will make the contrast and the color values really pop. And so in the end, you're probably wondering, am I keeping both of these, getting rid of one? What am I going to be doing with these two Steam Decks? And I have to say that the jury is not totally out on this. I'm going to give it about a week before I make my decision. But I will tell you right now, I am leaning very heavily towards keeping the 512GB model. When it comes down to it, when I'm just playing on a Steam Deck, I'm usually doing it at night. And as a result, I don't have a bunch of lights around. And so I think that's going to make the 512GB glossy model really pop. And for me, that's a quality that I really appreciate in a display. Now, the other half of that is that I am a content creator and I make a lot of videos with the Steam Deck, and using the glossy Steam Deck to make videos with my studio setup is kind of a nightmare. And so in that regard, I'm kind of holding off on making a final decision just because I have another video I'm working on too about emulation, and I want to see what the difference is going to be between the two when actually using it for work. Either way, when it comes down to it, if you are in the market for an OLED model, I think that either version is going to be great, and it'll really come down to what you prefer. Do you want something that's more glossy and poppier, or would you rather make sure that you're not getting a bunch of reflections if you're going to be using it in a well-lit environment? So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Which one are you going to be picking up? Which one did you already order and why? Or are you waiting for the Steam Deck 2 so you can get even better performance with probably a really nice screen as well? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.